Hi class, this video I'd like to cover a couple of the control structures from chapter 5. We're going to start getting involved in chapter 5 now. The first two big control structures are the if statement and the switch case statement, and they somewhat solve the same problem. If anybody has used one or the other or both, you'll know what I'm talking about. So the first one is an if statement. We've somewhat already done an if statement. Obviously in the Java class you've probably also done an if statement. It's pretty simple and straightforward. So for example, here's our if statement that we used for our calculate discount percent. We said if our radio button was checked, do something, otherwise continue on with your logic. Here's a little bit more complicated if statement. So if our subtotal is greater than 100 and less than 200, do something. Else, if it's between these two values, do something. Else if. So you can also have that sort of structure, if, else if, and then obviously an else for any other case that could happen. You could also do a nested if statement. So you could say if something happens, if your subtotal is greater than 100, and then you could also say within that statement, if your subtotal is less than that, do this, otherwise do something else. So you can have nested ifs, an if inside of an if. It's kind of the same as having an and, but there are legitimate use cases to have an if inside of an if. We already covered if your if statement only has one thing that it has to do, you don't have to have the brackets around it. And notice these statements also have the conditional operator. So here's an and condition. You can also have an or condition, which is just a pipe. So if the subtotal is greater than 200 or less than 250, obviously this won't work for this scenario, but this just evaluates whether one or the other is true. Or you can have a short circuit or, which will evaluate this first expression and only evaluate the second expression if it has to. If it doesn't have to evaluate this one, like if this one evaluates to true, it'll just go to the second one. So this is called a short circuit or operator. So that should about cover if statements. The last thing I wanted to cover were switch case statements. So I'll just cover the syntax for that, but a switch case essentially is kind of an if, else if, else if, else if. So you can have a variable and we'll say r equals something. So this is just a string variable. And then from there you can begin to evaluate what's going to happen depending on what this variable is. So first of all, you tell it which variable to look at, so in this case r. And then from there you can say case that r is s. Then I want the discount percent. Well, then I'll just put what happens when the case is s. Okay, and I think that actually needs to have a colon in front of it. And then it needs to have a break. Case r break. And then with a switch case, then you can have a default. It's kind of like your else. And the default is what happens if none of the cases are true. And it's always important to break after each statement because That's saying, okay, I found a case that works for this. Go ahead and evaluate it and do what you need to do, and then get out of this switch case and continue on with the rest of the code. So switch cases are really only good if you have a lot of different cases. Otherwise, they're just really cumbersome and ugly to look at, and it's probably easier just to do a switch statement. But if you do come to the conclusion that it would be best to use a switch case statement, they are useful if you have a lot of different cases, and this is the way that you would do it. So the next video I'll start covering for loops, while loops, and do while loops, so in your for each loop. So I'll see you then. Thanks.